Welcome to episode 312 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak encouragement into the hearts of educators and get you informed and energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm talking with Dr. John Spencer about brain-based ways to support kids who shut down in class. Visit truthforteachers.com for an easy-to-read, easy-to-share version of this podcast episode. If you use Google Chrome, you need to know about my favorite free Chrome extension for teachers. It's called Brisk Teaching, and it can instantly trim hours off the time it takes to write high-quality, personalized feedback on student work. And the feedback tool is just one of 30 plus that Brisk offers, including creating Google Slides and Google Form quizzes. Add Brisk to Chrome for free by heading to briskteaching.com. This episode is also brought to you by a really important podcast that I hope you'll check out. It's called Opportunity Gap: How to Support Kids of Color Who Learn Differently. It's hosted by Julian Saavedra, an assistant principal in Philadelphia who spent nearly 20 years working in public schools. You'll hear Julian talk with parents and experts to offer tools that will help you support your students. You can even share this free podcast with kids' families. It's a wonderful resource for parents as well. To listen to Opportunity Gap, just search for Opportunity Gap: How to Support Kids of Color Who Learn Differently in your podcast app. That's Opportunity Gap: How to Support Kids of Color Who Learn Differently. Today, I'm talking with a friend of mine that I've been connecting with for over 15 years. John Spencer and I first connected through our blogs way back in 2008, and we've been discussing all things education and entrepreneurship ever since. And I realized recently that I've never invited him on my podcast to share his wisdom with you all too. So I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. If you don't follow John yet, he is a former middle school teacher and now a current college professor. And he's on a quest to transform schools into bastions of creativity and wonder. His goal is to see teachers unleash the creative potential in all of their students so that kids can be makers, designers, artists, and engineers. John shares what he's learning through his books, his blog posts, journal articles, free resources he creates, animated videos, and podcasts. And in fact, if you like the Truth for Teachers podcast, you will almost certainly enjoy what he's doing over on the Creative Classroom podcast. So that's a great place to get familiar with his work. The podcast is called The Creative Classroom, and you'll see it's by John Spencer. So today, I wanted to talk to John about some different ways to support kids who shut down in class or get overwhelmed by too much choice or decision-making and otherwise just aren't able to complete their work. John's solutions are brain-based and they're creative and outside the box. I think you'll really enjoy them. Listen in. So, John, in a recent article you wrote, right now, coming out of the pandemic, I've noticed that one of the biggest challenges teachers are facing isn't student engagement so much as student empowerment. Many students are struggling to be self-directed learners who can self-start and self-manage. And in the article, you embedded this Venn diagram you illustrated with two sections, self-starter and self-manager. And the overlap in the middle is self-direction. And I thought that was such a powerful way to think about this idea of student empowerment rather than engagement, to really think about this overlap between being a self-starter and a self-manager. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so I want to begin by saying, one of the phrasing that I use there, which I know can be a little controversial, is coming out of the pandemic. And I want to recognize COVID's still around. Mm-hmm. People are still getting it. When I use the word pandemic in that moment, it was literally what is the health definition of a pandemic. So coming out of that. And as we think about self-direction, there are some reasons why we saw this. And what I noticed in talking to teachers all around the country and actually around the world, what I've noticed in working with pre-service teachers is the pandemic led to this sort of upside down bell curve, right? This binomial area where some of the students left that resilient and strong and self-directed, and were amazed by their their maturity. We're like, they are so great at getting started and self-managing, and something about their environment, something about the way that they were taught in some cases, they learned how to get organized, how to own their learning, how to focus, how to do all of those things. Another group, it could be trauma. It could be low expectations and excusing missing work. It could be environment. It could be not getting the right scaffolds and supports they needed. For some reason, they're coming out of this period and they just don't know how to be self-directed. They don't know how to self-start. They don't know how to self-manage. And so the way I think about this self-management, self-starting is a self-starter can say, what needs to be done? What do I want to do? And then they get started. There's no delay. There's no procrastination. They just get started. A self-manager is able to say, how do I sustain that? How do I keep going? How do I manage my own learning? A self-starter who doesn't self-manage is that kid, and you've experienced this before, who jumps at the start of a project, who gets excited about it, and then stops working. Mm-hmm. They can't focus for long, extended periods of times. They don't know. I know you've done some great work, Angela, on flow. They don't know how to hit a state of flow, right? A student that is great at self-managing and struggles with self-starting, they are inconsistent, but once they get started, they just move into the state of hyper-focus. And so the goal is, how do we build that self-direction in our students? And part of where this is coming from for me, working at the university level, is our students that are on academic probation are not who you would think. The assumption traditionally is, well, they might be first generation college students who aren't used to college. They don't have a support network. Maybe they come in on academic probation and they have low skills. They're not. A lot of them are former valedictorians. They're people at the 3.5 to 4.0 grade point average. They are students who were good students when they were being watched, when they were monitored, when someone was focused on their engagement. They played the game of school. And they were the students whose parents were using parent view all the time and nagging them about getting work done. And now they're on their own and they're navigating university life on their own, and they're not getting started. They're not showing up to class. They're struggling for the first time ever in a class, and they're not self-managing, and they're lacking some of that metacognition, and they're giving up and they're withdrawing. And so that's where I think the hidden piece, we talk about student engagement all the time, is it's not just student engagement, it's student empowerment.
Mm. You know, it's interesting to think about that with college students, because I had the opposite experience. I've talked before on the show about how I was a terrible student in high school. And it was because I was being micromanaged, and I rebelled against that. I do not like people checking up on me, you know, or asking like, did you finish it yet? Or you should do this first. Like, why aren't you doing your homework? And then whatever. I rebelled against all of that and just wanted nothing to do with it. And then when I went away to college, all of a sudden, like, oh, I'm in charge. I get to decide am I going to class? Am I going to take notes? How am I going to take notes? And suddenly, because I had that piece, I was able to step into my own power, really, because I am one of those kids who had the self-direction and the self-management. I needed the space to be able to do it. And it's so interesting to see how different people's personalities react in those ways. And I remember my parents being like, why are you doing so much better in college? College is harder. Why is your room neater? Your dorm room is neat and your bedroom at home was a mess. Well, because I had the autonomy. And so I really thrived in that kind of environment. And you're right that is going to be the case for some kids. I think I would have been one who probably thrived during remote learning. I would have loved to be able to, that would have worked for me. And I don't think that most kids experience that. And sort of the same thing here.
Yeah. And, you know, it's interesting. All three of my own kids thrived in remote learning. But we always raised them to be self-directed. You know, it was the rule was in our house in third grade, you start doing your own laundry. You know, that's a small example. It was a parenting thing. I did not want to be the cliche snowplow parent, taking barriers away from my kids. And what that meant was I allowed my oldest to skate by with a, 3.0 grade average that was slightly weighted. And so it was probably lower than that. Got some season classes, but then went to community college, is playing baseball, got 4.0.
Wow.
And suddenly, and not just the grades, taking challenging classes, being unafraid to take challenging classes, assuming he's going to get a C in a class, but not freaking out. There's something about that freedom to fail that helps with that self-direction. And the way I describe it is like giving slack to develop grit, right? So saying, I think you're capable of this high standard, but I'm going to give you the slack to screw up along the ways so that you'll eventually get up there. And that, I think, is what you're describing is exactly like I saw this with my own kids. And some of it might be, having two parents who are entrepreneurs probably plays into it. I know before the podcast, we were talking about the entrepreneurial autonomy that just seems to be part of like our DNA or something.
Yeah.
But I do think it's something that teachers can cultivate in students, and work toward really focusing on building that self-direction. And one of the strategies I love is asking yourself and doing an audit of your classroom and saying, what am I doing for students that they could be doing for themselves? And I've done that with teachers of all grade levels. And it's really interesting to see that, sometimes you'll have an early childhood person who says, my kids aren't capable of that because they're still so young. And I say, well, have you visited a Montessori preschool? Have you visited a place where there's tons of self-direction? It can work at young grades. And then I'll hear, we teach so much content that's idealistic at the high school level. And I'll say, okay, well, but what are you doing for them that they should be doing for themselves? And, when I took that audit, it was everything from classroom jobs to self-assessment to scaffolds and supports. There's so many zones that you can do where we're doing too much of the work for students, and that robs them of that opportunity for self-direction.
Right. So for the kids who are like me, they sort of wither under that, and crumble because there's no room for self-expression. And for the kids who don't have those skills, it's not being cultivated for them. And you're so right that like these things can be taught. Even if you are not a self-directed learner by nature, you can still develop those habits. And that's really a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. And the tie into creativity, I think, is really interesting. I know you are a big advocate for creative constraints and having limits and how that can function as the starting point for creativity. So when we're thinking about how too much choice or self-direction can be hard for a lot of kids, why is that? What do we need to understand about that from a neuroscientific standpoint and from your understanding of how creativity works?
So I think some of it connects to the idea of, cognitive load, and that literally within a brain science standpoint, your working memory can only be taxed so much, right? Some of it might deal with executive function skills as well, but let's just focus on working memory for a second. If you give students too vague of a project, an assignment, whatever, and on top of that, you have unclear expectations, they're going to have a lot of what's called extraneous cognitive load on their working memory to just figure out what to do. And so it actually gets in the way of learning. I experienced this myself the first time I did a Genius Hour project. I was like, learn whatever you want, and then you're going to explain it however you want. It was a nightmare. What it taught me was that we have to provide choice in a way that does not lead to choice paralysis. So, there's an older book now, TED Talk, The Paradox of Choice. We see it all the time, right? Too much choice overwhelms us. And what's happening is we're hitting cognitive overload. Kids are going to hit choice paralysis if you give too many choices. and if you make things too open-ended. And so I think it's really important from the neuroscience standpoint to say, how do we reduce cognitive overload? And there's a few ways that we do it. The first thing that we do is, if we're doing a big project, we break it up into phases and we use protocols that are predictable. So from project to project, we reuse protocols so they're not having to learn new protocols all the time. That's what people in the industry do all the time. So if you're like, that feels less authentic than just an open-ended project. No, that's what people in industries do during projects. If you're doing something like a regular creative assignment, it means limiting the number of choices that you have and being very clear on what's expected. It means having a loose and a tight on any kind of creative assignment. So the loose, I'll use my Genius Hour example. The loose was, you get to choose whatever topic you want. The tight was, instead of Genius Hour, the tight is going to be, it's going to be a blog. You're going to write. You're going to have a listicle. You're going to have a how-to. You're going to have a persuasive piece. You're going to hit these different things. And then you're going to have an optional one where you get to choose from 3 different options. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. There's this loose and this tight. And what that does is, for the student like you who's super self-directed and they have a clear idea, they get excited about the topics. They're ready to run. Okay. But for that student that needs extra support, and that student is overwhelmed by choice, and that student who goes, I just need the teacher to tell me what to do, it gives them clear parameters.
Walk us through the gradual release model. You've written quite a bit about that, and you have a really good article that I'm going to link to for this post, and about how to help prevent students from shutting down due to overwhelm or lack of empowerment. So there's 4 different levels of autonomy and choice, and your recommendation is to stay at level 1 and 2 for a while before gradually integrating level 3 and 4 activities. So let's talk about these levels of student choice and what might it look like to work through them.
So I think there's a couple of ways we can imagine this. One is, I remember how I said we do a choice audit for our classroom. Break those into categories, and then do a year-long plan of when you're going to integrate new aspects of choice. So one thing we can do is a year-long plan. We'll start there. And we say, as a teacher, look, I'm not going to do students selecting their scaffolds and supports. I love universal design. I want to run with that, but not on day 1. I'm going to pull small groups. But later in the 3rd or 4th week of school, I'm going to start making all of those supports available to all students. And I'll eventually, in the 2nd semester, tell students we're switching from small groups to workshops. Or, you take this gradual approach throughout the school year, and you're saying, later in the school year, I'm going to do students selecting scaffolds and supports. But in day 1, I am going to give them options on choosing their topic, right? I'm going to let them choose, and so what you're doing is all these areas, whether it's assessment, choice menus, topics, choosing their strategies, owning the project management, whatever it may be, what you're doing is you're mapping it out according to an entire year, so you don't overwhelm them with too much choice in the beginning. What I will say along with this is, you can do this as an individual teacher. You can do this as an entire team if you're in a middle school. You can do this as an entire school if you're an elementary school, and you say, what does it look like to gradually add more self-direction from kindergarten through 8th grade, right? And so it recognizes additional areas. I'll give an example for me. I could not do classroom jobs on day 1. That was overwhelming to kids. That was a 2nd quarter thing that I integrated, a classroom economy with classroom jobs that they would do and things like that. So that's one layer. That's the entire school year. Okay. But then what you can also do is, for key areas, you take a gradual release from level 1 to 3 to 2 to 3 to 4. So let's take choice menus or choosing the topic, right? You start out with a level 1 being, I'm going to give you 3 options on your warm up today. Pretty comfortable. Level 2, I'm going to give you a tic-tac-toe board in elementary and you get to choose the assignment, but we're all doing the same learning targets. Level 3, I'm going to do something where it's going to be a choose your own adventure and you select which learning targets you want to do. That's going to send you to a curation of 3 resources. You select which of those 3 resources you want to do, and then you get to choose your end product. And then level 4 would be something like a geek out blog, a genius hour, something like that. And so what we're doing is that gradual release. Another example of gradual release would be you do a design sprint, a divergent thinking challenge. You have 4 objects. You get to create any kind of children's toy with this 4 objects, 45 minutes. We're going to walk through the design thinking process fast. Go. Okay. And then we're going to move into a week-long project. And then we're going to move into a full-scale design thinking project later in the year. And so that's a gradual release. I'll give one last example. Another gradual release process would be kind of level 1. We're going to do research. Kids who don't know how to research, they're in 4th grade. They're really beginning to learn how to do online research. Day 1, we're all going to read the same article. I'm going to model for you how to do the research. It's going to be clear, explicit. Someone walks into that, they're going to think it's, traditional. Okay. There's nothing wrong with traditional, right? I love traditional sometimes. I'm all about vintage innovation. And then day 2, though, you're giving them an option between 3 different articles to choose from. And you have them do a graphic organizer that you select. You do that during day 2, maybe day 3 as well. And you expand it to 5 different articles to read. And then you give them an option of 2, maybe 3 different graphic organizers that they want to use, and an option of the curated list of articles. Mm-hmm. And then you model again, and each day you're modeling that research process. You're doing a couple quick Google searches, showing them how it works. And then you model, you do guided practice, you do peer feedback on how to answer your own question using a Google search and using a graphic organizer. And now they've moved into independent research that they actually own along the way. And so notice what we're doing is it's a gradual release approach that helps guarantee that students who need learning supports get the learning supports. But it also says, even if you need learning supports, language scaffolds, scaffolds for neurodiverse students, even if you have that, you can still own your learning. You can still be self-directed, because we're all going to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's going to lead to a lot fewer kids shutting down and feeling overwhelmed or just not sure where to take it, that decision paralysis that we've talked about. And, it makes sense within the context of this conversation, but often when we see kids shutting down or not working in class, you've given the assignment, they know what to do, and they're just sort of sitting there. We often assume that the problem is behavioral. And so we reach for behavioral solutions. But the way that the lesson itself is explained, presented, implemented, structured, assessed, all of these other things can be powerful aspects to tweak. So when it feels like the behavior management tools aren't working, when you're in that place where it's like, I've tried everything, maybe it's not the behavioral toolbox we need to be reaching into. Maybe some tweaks to the lesson design would really impact student empowerment. What strategies can teachers tap into in those kinds of situations where it's like, I have scaffolded learning. This is appropriate. It's an appropriate level of choice. The majority of the class is able to be successful, but there's still these kids who are just sitting there. What do I do?
And that's a challenge. I want to recognize in that there's no magic formula here. So I want to begin with that. One of the things that I'll say is when we think about students shutting down, we need to be asking the question as a diagnostic approach, like, what are all the reasons why a student is shutting down? So one reason could be a fear of failure and a low self-efficacy, right? They want to do it, but they just don't believe they can. So what do you do in that moment? Well, you might have to restructure the assignment to create some early wins. and build momentum. And just for them, the assignment's different. It could be that there's a mismatch in the efficacy between the challenge of the task and the skill level. That's where I think AI is really powerful in modifying assignments based on a student's skill level. And now, I mean, differentiation is a game changer. It's going to reduce teacher stress. It's going to make differentiation feasible. I am seeing this already. Use those tools. It's not cheating to use those tools to design scaffolds. So sometimes it's that. Sometimes it is a lack of clarity. They don't know what is being asked of them. And in that moment, I think it really helps to do a UX design audit. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it, but are you using consistent language? Are you using visuals that make it clear what you're supposed to do? Do you have simple action verbs? Have you put things into a bullet point? Sometimes it's an attention issue. And so they care about the assignment, but they're not staying focused. Create a to-do list for them. And the to-do list includes the first 5 options are easy wins that they're going to cross off on the to-do list. I have my materials. I've turned to my neighbor and I've said, I will blank. What it looks like when I'm done is blank. And what you're doing is you're building metacognition and you're helping students think visually about time, which students with low executive function skills, students with ADHD as well, tend to struggle at thinking visually about time. So what are we doing? Simple strategies with a to-do list and a quick turn and talk, which is just a great strategy, period. I always have turn to your neighbor and explain. If there's a lack of clarity on what to do, it could be their working memory is taxed. And what you've done is you've given multi-step directions without embedding practice into it. So my example is this. I can hear a multi-step direction in writing, and you can spend 45 minutes telling me what to write. I'm good to go. I won't even take notes. I'll remember it. If you give me a 3-step dance move, I'm screwed. People are like, this is what the electrics, I still don't know the electric slide. I have been at weddings for 20 years. Like, I mean, come on. And so, like, I need for kinesthetic activities, for things that I have very little life experience, like dancing, I need step 1, practice, step 2, practice, step 3, practice. So it might be that you need to break down those directions. If you can't do that for all students, a quick hack is make your directions a screencast video. We tend to over-explain in person. We tend to simplify when we do a screencast video, and it forces you to use visuals. And then a student who needs to rewind and listen to it again, or if a student, if there's language acquisition, they can slow it down to 0.5 and literally listen, pause, listen, pause. And I'm telling you, for me, I would say 25% of my students that were not getting started began to get started once they had those screencast videos when I was a middle school. So for me, that was like, oof, I should have been doing this all along. And notice these are small tweaks that we can make that lead to a big difference. That being said, sometimes it's still just space proximity, walk in the room, telling kids to get on task. I'm not going to lie, even as a college professor, sometimes for me, it literally is still nagging. Like, it's still being like, get to work. What should you be doing? Like, it still happens.
Yeah, I think that's important to acknowledge that, again, there is no magic fix. And I'm not even saying necessarily that there's something wrong if a student is not working. It doesn't mean there was something wrong with you or your lesson or with them. We're humans and we're having human experiences. It's normal sometimes for humans to stare and daydream or to have difficulty focusing that day. So, yeah, just thinking about these different tools is really helpful. What about like in the moment? If a lesson has been well designed, or maybe if it hasn't been well designed, but it's, you're in the middle of it right now, you've already given the directions and you have this kid, who is struggling to participate. How would you respond in the moment? What is your actual response to the student?
So this is assuming that the larger group is on task, right? So it's well designed, the pacing is good, things like that, right? I think a quick redirect question is really helpful. Something that allows them to save face, literally getting down at their level, kneeling down at their level, and just with a quiet, approachable voice. So don't treat it as a discipline thing. Don't use your authoritative voice. Just with an approachable voice, you say, what should you be working on right now? Mm-hmm. And then they tell you what they should be. If they go, I don't know, then that becomes a conversation, a clarification. All right, tell me what piece you've gotten started on. Tell me where you stuck. Where are you confused? In some cases, that might be a moment where we say, all right, you know what we're going to do right now? We're going to make a to-do list. We're going to make a checklist. And I'm going to, and little check boxes. And I have the students start making a checklist. Item number 1 is literally, I made a checklist. And so it's something like that. If they aren't getting started because they're failing to be self-starters, right? And it's purely based on, I just haven't gotten started. I'm not focused. There's a lack of clarity on the directions. That's a moment to rewatch the video if you need to, or clarify the directions if you need to. And these are short, simple conversations that just begin with that. If, on the other hand, it's something different, that's when it's going to take some work. And it might be motivation. I don't want to do this. All right. What about it? Why is it not interesting to you? Like, explain to me that lack of motivation. And I love frameworks in these moments. I love self-determination theory and the notion of like, how do you get people from external regulation or introjection? I'm doing this out of a feeling of guilt. I'm doing this out of feeding it my ego, into a place of identified regulation, which is I'm doing this out of a sense of purpose, or even integration. I'm doing this because it's who I am, or intrinsic motivation, which is I'm doing this out of fun. And so sometimes I just keep that mental model in my mind of like, where are they? They're in a motivation right now. And sometimes, I won't lie, like sometimes in that moment, I am going to use extrinsic motivation and just say, I know you don't want to do this. Can you at least do this? And then there'll be this reward. And I used to be one of those people that was like, rewards are bad. Don't use rewards. No. The reality is sometimes kids absolutely hate the task that they're doing, and you're going to have to start with that reward and then get them to a different place. So I think in the moment, that's it. It's short conversations at their eye level, approachable, and really the goal is reflective questions.
Mm-hmm. What's your approach when it's not just, a handful of kids, the usual ones who fall prey to this? So what happens when you're gradually releasing them to do a task? Let's say you're doing like a level 2 in terms of the independence, and you're noticing that like a good third of the class is confused. It's not making sense to them. They're asking each other, wait, what are we supposed to, what's your go-to strategy in that moment where you realize that actually like there's a large number of kids, I need to adjust this as a whole class, or at a more than just 1 or 2?
Yeah. So what I do in that moment is I immediately break it into one or the other. Either the directions are unclear or they don't know how to do it. If the directions are unclear, that's easy. I simplify the directions. I say, all right, I showed you the video. It was unclear. I am going to explain the directions to you and have you practice something related to it. And we're going to take 10 minutes. And kids are on board with that. And I'm just open. I'm like, hey, I can tell people are confused. I didn't do a very good job. Give me a scale of 1 to 5 visually for you. And I actually do this all the time, even now. 1 to 5. How good of a job did I explain the directions? So it's not on them. They get to save face, right? They're not, I'm confused. It's how clear was I on the directions? 1, not clear at all. It's clear as mayonnaise. It makes no sense, right? I don't know why I said mayonnaise, but like it's not clear at all. 5 being it's clear as water. Like it's like I know exactly what, like it's very clear to me. And I just see visually where folks are at. And if I see lots of 1s and 2s, I say, all right, I'm going to redo the directions. If you think that you know what to do and you're not confused, keep working while I explain. And I just let them work. If it's an issue of they don't know the academic concepts, the actual learning, that's when what I do is I call an impromptu workshop. And what I say is everyone can continue working on their project, but what I'm going to do is over on this corner of the room, bring your computers or paper with you or whatever. We're going to do a workshop, and I'm going to guide you in how to do this, re-explain how to do this, whatever it may be, video editing, two-step equations, using supports to back up your topic sentence, whatever it may be. I'm going to run a workshop. Anyone can join this workshop, and you're not going to be punished in terms of missing the work that you were working on. And I let them know, all right, we're going to go for it. There's some flexibility here. I'm pulling you aside, and I'm running this as an optional workshop. And what that does is to everyone who knows it, they get to keep going. But anyone who doesn't, it's an immediate scaffold and support.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I found when you do that with younger students too, there's an added bonus because it's like more time with the teacher. Like the rest of the class is working. It's like you can come over to the rug, and I'm gonna workshop this. I called it small group, but I like the idea of a workshop a lot better. That sounds fun and like interactive. Like there were kids who I think they did understand, but they wanted that extra time with me. They wanted that extra support. And why not? And I would have kids also walk away afterwards. Like they'd start for like 5 minutes. Okay, I got it. And then I'm going back to my seat. Go. That's fantastic. Mm-hmm. That is self-directed.
Yeah. And I love that. I think I never did that, but I should have. I should have said, once you get it, you can take off. It's a simple, notice all of these things can be things that you do on the fly quickly. Mm-hmm. And they should be manageable and feasible. They should not be overwhelming for you.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it's going to be a lot better than just continuing, because I think sometimes we feel so pressed for time that it's like, I gave the directions, they need to just get started. But taking that time to say, okay, I've got a fair amount of students here who are not ready to get started, or they're not diving in, taking that time to pull them over for that workshop can kind of get things back on track, so that you're not wasting time having to redirect each and every individual student. I found that if I'm asked the same question more than twice, I'm probably going to stop the class. And I really hate interrupting people when they're learning and when they're working. But if I keep getting the same thing, I'm going to stop everybody, because it's like, it's clear. Eventually this is going to come up. Like, let me just have your attention for 1 second. Several people have asked about this. I didn't do a great job clarifying that. Let me just explain. I meant this, this, and this, and then let them go back to it. And then making a note for that, about that for myself for next time in the lesson plans. Hey, make sure when you release them to do this, you clarify this first, and, really honing in on being able to give super clear, specific directions.
Yeah. And sometimes it's those on the fly, small things, like re-explain things with a small T-chart that you put up on the board. We were doing lesson planning with my class the other night, and they're learning how to lesson plan for the first time. And the lesson plan format that they use has objectives and learning targets. And I explain how to turn an objective into a learning target. A bunch of them were confused on what is the difference between a learning target and an objective. Mm-hmm. So literally all it took was I made a really quick T-chart that was like, learning target is, objective is for the teacher, learning target is for the student. Objective uses complex language, learning target, student-friendly language. Objective can be, but is not always referenced out loud and put on the board. Learning target always is, right? It clicked. Mm. And these are adults, right? These are pre-service teachers. And it was just a simple T-chart. Well, I used to have to do that all the time with middle school students. Sometimes it was vocabulary that gets confusing. Sometimes it's, our brain experiences what's called interference all the time, where we get confused between two different ideas, or we get confused by what this means compared to what we did last time. And just a small T-chart, just a Venn diagram, just reworking a problem on the board for a second. These don't always have to be big, massive reteach. I think one of the pitfalls, especially for new teachers, is they'll go, that didn't work, stay the course and reteach it tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really saying, okay, we don't need to reteach it tomorrow. Let's redo it now in a way that really focuses on that empowerment piece.
Yeah, I think that's super important to not, if something is not working, don't just keep going forward with it. Adjust on the fly. And it's a lot easier to adjust on the fly when you're experienced.
Yes.
Like you were able to think of that T-chart because you've had so much teaching experience, and it's harder when you're new. But, you don't have to have a lot of tools in your toolbox. You just need a couple things. Even just that workshop strategy, is something, that's really effective. And also, I mean, we touched briefly on the role of AI, but I just see AI as being so powerful here. The way that you can have a chatbot tutoring the student, like actually guiding them through. So you have this differentiated article, the kids read the article, and then they interact with the chatbot. So if you have students who really respond well to that, or maybe, they're embarrassed when you're walking them through it, but they're not going to be embarrassed in front of the bot. They can ask what they feel like is a dumb question, like, what does this word mean? There's so many great AI tools that are just absolute minimal work for the teacher and just provide so much scaffolding, support, and differentiation. It's powerful. Do you want to speak to that? What are you seeing that is really working well?
Oh, I mean, it's exactly what you said. And it's a lot of AI tools. It's the ability to hop onto Magic School or Diffit, or, like it's the ability to use Conmigo with students and have something that's a chatbot that's actually developmentally appropriate, but it's also using those pre-existing tools of ChatGPT and Gemini to just crank out a to-do list for students, or a scaffold, or some skill practice. One of the things that happens is sometimes kids just literally need a sort of old-fashioned worksheet type thing. I think it's worksheets.ai. Worksheet.ai.
Yep.
That, I think you were the person that told me that, and I played around with it and was like, this is amazing, And so it's all those different tools, and just having an arsenal of tools that you can use, but not being tool driven, right? Being task driven, being focused on how do we build that self-direction, and then using those tools to just give students the tools themselves that they can use to build that self-management and that self-starter mindset.
Mm-hmm. I found that ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, whatever your preferred tool is really, really good at simplifying and rewording directions.
Yes. Oh
I use it all the time for that. I'm like, define this word for a fifth grader. How do I explain this concept to a third grader? What, when we're talking about like ethical AI use for students, how would I explain that to a high school level student? And ChatGPT, all of these tools, these AI tools, do a great job rewording things. If you give it a paragraph of instructions for students and say, break this down into bullet points or checklists, it will do that for you. So you don't have to modify these instructions. And, this is new. This has only been happening in the last, maybe 2 years or so. A lot of teachers are not aware of how much these tools have developed, how much you can do for free, not having to pay for these tools. And it will allow you to be proactive with students in helping them be self-directed and helping them have the supports they need without you having to reinvent the wheel and do all of this yourself.
Absolutely.
I want to close out the show with a takeaway truth, something for folks to remember for the week ahead. What's something that you wish every teacher understood about what we talked about today about student empowerment?
I think my big takeaway that I hope you would get is that student empowerment is not a free-for-all. It involves teachers actively working with students, using protocols, using structures, creating systems. And I didn't really mention this, but this is the end thought would be that requires you as a teacher to be empowered yourself. I truly believe that empowered teachers empower students. And so the idea there would be, how can you design the systems, the scaffolds, the supports, and that gradual release approach in a way that's structured, but at the same time builds that student ownership?